I can't breathe. Please. I need my inhaler. Those were the last words Tiffany Harris managed to say before Officer Daniels slammed her face against the cold pavement, arresting her for something as trivial as a broken taillight. Her chest tight, her breath shallow, her kids in the back seat screaming in terror. But none of that mattered to Officer Daniels. His grip on her arms tightened as he forced the cuffs on her wrists, ignoring her gasps for air, her desperate pleas for help. The inhaler she kept in her purse, the one thing that could save her life, was tossed to the side as the officer shoved her into the back of his patrol car. Hours later, she was dead, alone in a cell with nothing but the silence of her own suffering. Over and over again, she hit the call button, hoping for someone, anyone, to hear her, but no one came. By morning, Tiffany Harris was gone, her life snuffed out by the very system that was supposed to protect her. Malik Harris stands alone in a dark, empty room, lit only by a faint overhead light. He is a 24-year-old black man with deep brown skin, a lean but muscular build, and a cold, unreadable face. His black hair is cut in a low fade with subtle waves. He wears a dark hoodie, black jeans, and combat boots. His look is quiet, sharp, and anonymous. His expression is stone-cold, eyes narrowed and scanning the shadows. Rage is visible in his posture, controlled but seething under the surface. His jaw is tight, fists slightly clenched, but his movements are calm, almost too calm. The room around him feels tense and empty, hinting at something that just happened or is about to. There are no signs of violence, just silence, intensity, and a sense of eerie finality. Malik stands as if transformed, no longer just a grieving son, but a man shaped by pain, injustice, and a mission. The scene is quiet, atmospheric, and emotionally heavy. A tense night scene on a quiet city street. Blue and red lights from a police cruiser flash across an old worn-out station wagon parked by the curb. Inside the car sits Tiffany Harris, a black woman in her late 30s with dark brown skin and shoulder-length black curls, tied back simply. She wears a modest worn blouse and light jacket, the look of a working-class mother. Her expression is calm but weary, her hands resting tensely on the steering wheel. She's been through this before, shaken but never broken. A few feet away, standing at the edge of a dim alleyway, is Marcus, a young black man in his late 20s with deep brown skin and dreadlocks tied back. He wears grease-stained jeans, work boots, and a hoodie. His face holds quiet rage, his body still but tense, hands buried in his pockets. His eyes are locked on the scene with suspicion and fear. His heart is pounding, but he doesn't move. He's been here before, seen this unfold too many times. The atmosphere is silent and thick with tension. The hum of the city fades, as if the world is holding its breath. The street is empty, shadows long under the harsh light of the flashing patrol car, hinting that something is about to go wrong. A nighttime street scene lit by the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser. Lena, a black woman in her early 40s with dark brown skin and long box braids fraying at the ends, stands beside her old car with her hands raised. She wears a faded floral dress and cardigan, clothes of a tired but dignified woman. Her face is calm, but her eyes show fear. She is speaking in a steady, respectful voice, trying to keep the situation under control. Two officers stand near her. The first is Officer Daniels, a broad-shouldered white man with a pale, ruddy face, buzz-cut dirty blonde hair, and a sweat-streaked brow. His uniform is tight, and he chews gum aggressively. He is barking commands, loud and hostile. The second is Officer Jason Halt, a stocky man with olive-toned skin and military-style shaved hair, dressed in full tactical gear, even though it's a routine stop. His face is tense, eyes sharp, jaw clenched. He radiates impatience and aggression. Body language is defensive but composed, even as the officers begin circling her. Suddenly, Halt grabs her arm roughly and pulls her toward the back of the car. She stumbles, catching herself against the bumper, gasping, "Please, I need my inhaler, I can't breathe." Across the street, Marcus, her 28-year-old son, watches from the edge of an alley. He has deep brown skin and dreadlocks tied back. He wears a hoodie and grease-stained jeans. He's a mechanic, built strong and silent. His expression is tight, fists clenched in his pockets. He looks terrified but frozen in place, heart pounding as he sees his mother's panic. The officers push Lena's upper body down against the cold metal hood. Her chest rises and falls rapidly. She's struggling to breathe. Her purse, which contains her inhaler, is visible through the open car door, lying on the floor of the passenger seat, forgotten, ignored. The street is tense and silent, except for the flash of lights and Lena's gasping voice. A tragic stillness is beginning to form around the moment, like something terrible is about to happen but hasn't fully landed yet. Stay down. You're not going anywhere. The cop spat, his hand tightening around her arm. Lena tried to speak, but the words weren't coming out. Her body shook as she struggled for breath, her hands pulling at the cuffs that dug painfully into her wrists. Marcus' chest tightened as he watched, his stomach turning into knots. The sirens wailed in the distance, but there was no help coming. The other officers stood by, indifferent, watching as Lena struggled. And Marcus couldn't understand how no one stepped in to help her. He couldn't make sense of it, the way his mother's life was being stripped away, the way the people who were supposed to protect her stood by, doing nothing. He felt a deep, helpless rage building inside him. His mother's life was slipping through his fingers, and the officers didn't care. None of them cared. Double quotes. Please. Please, just let me have it. Lena pleaded, her voice barely a whisper now, hoarse from the effort. The inhaler was just out of reach, and Marcus knew it was too late. She wouldn't survive without it. But instead of responding, the officers turned away. They'd already made their decisions. His mother was just another black woman in the system, another statistic, and the officers didn't care about her needs. It wasn't until the third officer showed up that Marcus felt a sudden, cold realization flood his body. He knew what was about to happen, and he couldn't stop it. His mother's face went pale as she gasped for air, her vision blurring from the lack of oxygen, her limbs shaking. She was slipping, slowly dying in front of them, and no one cared enough to stop it. Let her go. Marcus screamed, his voice rising from the alley where he stood, but it was too late. By the time the officer who had been standing guard walked back to the car, Lena's body had already gone limp. She was unconscious now, her chest still but not moving, her body a dead weight in the officer's hands. The cop glanced at her, then at the rest of the officers, and nodded. Take her to jail. We'll sort this out later, he said casually, his voice indifferent. The sirens grew louder, but they did nothing to alleviate the crushing weight in Marcus' chest. His heart was breaking, his lungs gasping for air as if they too had been caught in his mother's suffocating grasp. The tension escalated as Lena was dragged away, her lifeless body tossed into the back of the squad car. She was a mother, a woman who had loved him with all her heart, and now she was being treated like nothing more than a burden. The officers' indifference haunted Marcus as he stood frozen in the alley. He couldn't move, he couldn't breathe. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. His mother had just been killed, and it didn't matter. Not to them, not to the officers, not to the system that had promised to protect her. They had failed her, just like they failed so many others. Marcus fell to his knees in that dark alley, his fists clenched, rage building up inside him like fire, the raw grief threatening to consume him. He stared up at the dark sky above him, the city lights flickering in the distance as his mother's final words echoed in his mind. Please, I need my inhaler. I can't breathe. The words replayed over and over again, louder and louder, until they became his truth. And in that moment, Marcus knew something that would change him forever. He wasn't just angry, he was done being a victim. His mother had been failed by a system that had sworn to protect her. She was a statistic, a name in a report, but she was his mother, and they would pay. Marcus sat in the dim light of his apartment. The air thickened. Still, the silence in the room was suffocating, but it wasn't the kind of silence you could escape. He could still hear his mother's voice echoing in his head, desperate and strained, asking for help, pleading for air, but nothing ever came. His hands gripped the remote, his knuckles white, as the footage of her arrest played on the TV screen. For the 100th time, he had already watched it more times than he cared to admit, replaying every second, every breath, every moment where he could have been there, where he could have stopped them. But it was too late now. The system had already failed her. The footage was grainy, but it didn't matter. Marcus knew what had happened. He could see his mother, calm at first, trying to understand why the officer was pulling her over. He could hear the exchange in her voice, the exhaustion of a woman who had lived through this before, who had been stopped by cops so many times. She knew exactly how it would go. But then things turned quickly. The officer's voice became sharper. The situation escalated. He could see his mother's breathing becoming labored, her panic rising as the cuffs were slapped onto her wrists. Her inhaler lay on the pavement, discarded and forgotten. He shut off the TV, the screen going dark, but the images burned in his mind. He was alone now, alone with the grief, the rage, and the unbearable weight of knowing his mother had died because of a system that didn't care. His apartment was empty except for the sounds of his own breath, shallow and uneven, as though his lungs couldn't keep up with the pressure in his chest. He rubbed his face, feeling the sting of tears that never seemed to come. It was as if his heart had been hollowed out, leaving only a bitter emptiness. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. Another message. Another call from a friend or family member asking if he was okay. He didn't answer. He hadn't answered anyone in days. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he couldn't find the words. What was there to say? How could he explain the weight of the loss, the depth of his pain, when there was no justice to be had? When no one was going to bring his mother back? They all knew. His friends, his family, the whole community knew what had happened. They knew about the arrest. They knew about the video, but none of them were the ones left with the burning question that ate away at him every minute of every day. Why? Why had the cops treated her like this? Why hadn't anyone listened when she begged for help? Why had they left her to die alone in that cell? His jaw clenched, and for a moment he felt the raw urge to pick up his phone and lash out, to call someone, anyone, and scream at them, but he knew it wouldn't help. It wouldn't bring his mother back. Instead, he stood and walked over to the small window by his desk. The city below was quiet, the lights blinking in the distance, but the quietness didn't ease the storm that was raging inside him. He felt like he was suffocating, like the walls were closing in on him, and no matter how much he tried to take a deep breath, the air wouldn't come. The thought crossed his mind again, the thought he had been avoiding. What was he supposed to do now? The system had failed. He had seen it firsthand. The police, useless. The DA, complicit. The courts, corrupted. No one would bring justice for his mother, no matter how many protests or calls for change the community made. He had already seen the reports, the paperwork that had been signed off. The official cause of death marked as asthma complications. They had written her off with one sentence. No mention of the inhaler, no mention of the guards who ignored her cries, no mention of the officer who had thrown her purse aside like it was nothing. The weight of it hit him again, the realization that his mother had died, not just because of a medical condition, but because she was a black woman in a system that didn't give a damn about her life. His fists clenched at his sides, the anger surging in his chest like fire. They didn't care. No one cared. For the first time in days, Marcus stood up, his movements deliberate. He walked to the small kitchen and grabbed a glass of water, trying to calm himself, but his thoughts wouldn't stop. The rage inside him was growing, boiling over, and it was all directed at one thing: the system. The system that had taken his mother, that had ignored her pleas, that had left her to die in a cold cell. He set the glass down with a trembling hand, his reflection staring back at him in the kitchen window. He looked different now. The man who had once smiled at the world, who had found solace in his family and community, was gone. The grief had taken him, twisted him, and turned him into something else. Someone who wasn't going to wait around for justice that would never come. It wasn't about revenge, not at first. It was about justice, about holding those responsible accountable. But as the days passed, Marcus realized something. Justice wasn't coming. No one would make them pay for what they had done to his mother. So, he would make them pay himself. A quiet resolve began to form inside him. He couldn't bring her back, but he could make sure no one else had to suffer like she did. He would take the power back. He would make the system listen, whether it wanted to or not. Marcus walked over to his desk, opening the drawer where he kept his mother's things, her old photos, some letters, and, tucked at the bottom, the obituary they had published. It was a small, stark reminder of the life she had led, and the way it had ended. He grabbed the obituary, folding it carefully, and placed it in the back pocket of his jeans. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do yet, but he had a plan. It would take time, it would take patience, but he would bring those officers to justice, one by one. No more. No more turning the other cheek. No more waiting for the system to do its job when it was too busy protecting those who should be held accountable. As the days passed, Marcus' resolve only grew stronger. He spent hours researching, connecting the dots, and learning everything he could about the officers involved. He didn't trust anyone in the system anymore, so he worked alone, quietly, meticulously. The police had their own network, their own way of protecting each other, but Marcus had learned how to move in the shadows. He wasn't going to wait around for the media to call it a murder or for the public to demand justice. He was going to make them pay on his terms. The inner conflict gnawed at him, though. Marcus knew this path wouldn't bring his mother back. No amount of bloodshed could undo what had happened. But his grief, the hollow ache in his chest, drove him forward. Each officer he crossed off his list would be one more step towards his goal, towards making sure his mother's death wasn't just another name on a list. It would be a message to anyone who thought they could ignore black lives and get away with it. He knew what he was doing wasn't right, but he couldn't stop. He had seen too much injustice, felt too much pain, and now there was no turning back. The need for revenge wasn't just a desire anymore, it was a compulsion. The loss of his mother had ignited something inside him that couldn't be extinguished. His heart ached with every kill he knew he would make, but the cold, dead weight of grief in his chest urged him to move forward. This was the only way to make sure the world knew that his mother's life had mattered. He wasn't going to wait for the system to give him justice, but Marcus was going to take it. The night was colder than Marcus expected, the wind biting at his skin as he stood just outside the shadow of an old brick building. His breath came out in heavy, deliberate puffs, like steam rising from a kettle. The world felt quieter tonight. Even the usual hum of the city seemed muted, as if it too were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The weight of his actions had already settled on him, but the final step, actually carrying it out, was heavier than he imagined. Tonight was the night. He'd known this was coming, but it didn't make it easier. The cop who had been directly involved in his mother's arrest of Sir Mitchell Hawkins was his target. Marcus had studied him for days, watching the man's routines, learning his habits, finding out where he went and what time he did it. Hawkins had been on patrol the night his mother died, but it wasn't just about him pulling the trigger. It was about the whole system that protected him, that turned a blind eye to the pain and suffering of people like Marcus and his mother. Hawkins was just the first. Marcus checked his phone. The screen glowed softly in the darkness. It was 11:45 p.m. Hawkins would be finishing his shift soon. Marcus knew exactly where he would be stopping for a late-night coffee at the corner diner, a place he went to every night, like clockwork. He could almost feel the blood in his veins turning cold, the tension building as the minutes ticked. By dot he could do this. He had to do this. His mother's last breath, her desperate pleas for air, still haunted him. Those images were seared into his memory, burned into his soul. He could still hear her voice, still see her terrified eyes as the officers ignored her. That sound, the rasping, gasping breath she made before everything went silent, was a noise he would never forget. And now, it was his turn to make them listen. Marcus moved quickly, his feet soundless on the concrete as he slipped into the alley. The dim light of the diner flickered ahead. The door opened, and there was Hawkins, just as expected, exiting the diner with a paper cup in his hand. He looked tired, unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. He got into his car with the same tired motions, his mind somewhere far away. Marcus stayed hidden in the shadows, his heart pounding but his mind calm. He had planned this out, studied every step, every move. Tonight, there would be no mistakes. He took one last steadying breath and stepped forward, walking out of the alley and into the street, blending with the shadows like a predator closing in on its prey. The car started, its engine humming to life as Hawkins pulled out of the diner's parking lot. Marcus followed at a distance, his eyes locked on the vehicle. He knew this area like the back of his hand, the alleyways, the side streets, the places where he could disappear if he needed to. Hawkins didn't know it, but he was walking right into Marcus' plan. It was only a matter of time. The car took a left turn and headed down a quieter street, and Marcus followed, keeping a safe distance. He watched as Hawkins made his way down the familiar route, the streetlights flickering above them. Marcus' pulse quickened. He could feel that the moment was coming. He pulled his jacket tighter around him and reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the cold steel of the gun. The weight of it was nothing new. He had carried it for days, waiting for this moment. He knew what had to be done. He had already imagined this moment 1,000 times in his head, what it would feel like, what it would sound like. Hawkins turned into a narrow street, and Marcus saw his chance. The officer's car was parked in a darkened area by a closed building, the headlights off, the engine still running. Marcus moved quickly, silently, approaching the car from behind. Hawkins was sitting in the front seat, his head tilted back, eyes closed, exhausted after another shift. Marcus paused, his breath shallow as he took in the scene. There it was, the man who had been complicit in his mother's death. The man who had watched as she begged for help and did nothing. He could feel the anger rise again, hotter and sharper than before. The world seemed to slow down as Marcus stepped forward, his footfall muted against the cold pavement. Hawkins didn't hear him coming. He was still leaning back in his seat, unaware. The tension in the air was thick, like the quiet before a storm. Marcus' hand tightened around the handle of the gun, his fingers cold but steady. He could see Hawkins' slow, rhythmic breathing as the man relaxed, oblivious to the danger that was creeping up on him. The weight of the gun in his hand was familiar, but it felt different tonight. This wasn't just some random act. This wasn't just vengeance. This was justice, his justice, the only justice that would be served for his mother. He had waited for this moment, planned for it, and now it was here. With one fluid motion, Marcus opened the door to Hawkins' car, yanked the officer out, and threw him against the ground. The officer was disoriented, gasping for air, but Marcus didn't give him the chance to speak. The gun was cold against his hand, steady in the chaos of his mind. Hawkins was struggling, his hands reaching out for his weapon, but Marcus was faster. The officer's mouth opened to shout something, but Marcus was already on him, his voice a low growl. "Not today, officer." The shot rang out, echoing in the stillness of the night, the sound sharp and clean, a punctuation to everything that had led up to this moment. Hawkins' body slumped to the ground, lifeless. His weapon never reached his hand. His last breath escaped in a rattled gasp, and Marcus stood over him, breathing heavily but feeling nothing. As Marcus looked down at the officer's body, something deep inside him twisted. This was it. This was what he had set out to do, exactly what he had planned for days. He had taken action, he had made them pay. But as he watched Hawkins' body, a profound emptiness washed over him. The anger, the rage, the need for revenge was all still there, still burning, but there was no satisfaction in it, no peace. He had thought that ending this man's life would bring him closer to healing, closer to making his mother's death mean something, but instead, the emptiness only deepened. Hawkins was just the first. The system was still intact. It wasn't just about killing these cops. The city was still broken, and his mother, she was still gone. Marcus stood there for a long moment, watching the officer's body, the quiet streets. Around him, the guilt and anger waged war inside him. He couldn't stop now. He knew that. The system had failed him. His mother had been betrayed, and now, so had everyone who had been complicit. But it didn't feel like justice. It felt like a hollow victory. The sound of approaching sirens broke his thoughts. Marcus moved quickly, slipping into the shadows and disappearing into the alleyway. He knew the game wasn't over, not by a long shot. The first officer had fallen, but there were many more to go. He wasn't done, not yet. The death of Officer Hawkins was only the beginning. The news would spread like wildfire. The department would scramble. They would put pieces together, and the fear would grow. The whispers had already begun. Who was this avenger, and why were they targeting the cops involved in his mother's death? No one knew it was Marcus yet, but it wouldn't take long. The city would be on edge. The police would be looking over their shoulders, and Marcus would be waiting. As Marcus disappeared into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same. He had taken a life, the first life in a series of actions he had set into motion. But with every officer who fell, he realized more and more that his quest for revenge wasn't going to bring him peace. His mother would never come back. No matter how many officers he brought down, he would always be left with the same empty ache in his chest. The system had failed them both, and that was the hardest truth of all. The room was heavy with tension. Detective Carter flipped through the file in front of him, his eyes scanning the crime scene photos of Officer Hawkins. It didn't make sense. He had been in law enforcement for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never seen a case like this. Officers killed in cold blood with no motive, number apparent connection, and no suspects. The evidence seemed clean, too perfect. No fingerprints, no shell casings, no witnesses, just the body of Officer Hawkins, found in an empty parking lot, the man's life snuffed out without so much as a struggle. The only thing that stood out was how it felt like someone had been watching, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "We're dealing with a professional here," Carter muttered, flipping another page of the report, his fingers trembling slightly. He looked up at his partner, Detective Patel, who stood across the room, his face etched with frustration. Patel ran a hand through his hair. "This is insane. One of our own gets killed, and now it's like we're next in line. There's no sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle, nothing. Just like Hawkins," Carter said, the weight of the case pressing down on his shoulders. "Too clean, too damn clean. Someone knows how to move in and out without leaving a trace." Patel looked over at the pile of evidence sitting untouched on the desk. "You think it's someone inside? Someone from the department?" Carter didn't respond immediately. The thought had crossed his mind, but he wasn't sure how to even begin investigating it. A leak from within, a cop turned vigilante, or worse, a hit job ordered from inside their own ranks. It didn't sit right. It couldn't sit right. They couldn't even fathom that someone would turn against their own like this. The door to the small office opened, and Captain Monroe stepped in, his expression grim. He was still trying to keep his composure after what happened to Hawkins, but it was clear the stress was getting to him. "We've got more bodies," Monroe said, his voice low, almost robotic. He handed Carter another report, his fingers tight, around the edges as though he was afraid to let go. Detective Reese is on the case. Another officer's been found dead. Carter's heart skipped. Who? Monroe hesitated before answering. Officer Briggs, found in a hotel parking garage. Same clean hit. No sign of forced entry, nothing to link it to anyone. No one heard a shot, no surveillance footage, no leads. Carter felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just a random act. Someone was systematically picking off the officers involved in his mother's death, and the department was stumbling in the dark, just like they always did. Each one of these deaths was a nail in their own coffin, but they couldn't even put the pieces together. This doesn't make sense, Patel said, his voice rising with frustration. How are we supposed to investigate a ghost? Whoever is doing this, they know exactly how to cover their tracks. It's like they're always one step ahead. Maybe they are, Monroe said quietly, his eyes narrowing. Maybe it's someone inside the department. Maybe it's someone who knows how we operate, who knows our weaknesses. The words hit Carter like a ton of bricks. They had been questioning the why, the how, but they hadn't considered the possibility that one of their own might be responsible. It's getting too close, Monroe muttered, pacing around the small office. We can't afford another body. We can't afford another officer dead with no answers. We need to find this killer, and fast. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. The news coverage picked up the story, feeding the frenzy that was already building in the streets. The protesters, who had once gathered for Kira's memorial, now marched for the fallen officers, chanting for justice, for answers. The streets were alive with anger and fear, and the media was only too eager to amplify it. Every headline, every news segment, asked the same question. Who was targeting the cops? Who was behind this? The department was scrambling to keep up with the mounting pressure. They were under the microscope, every move they made being dissected. Their every mistake, every slip-up was being exposed for the world to see. And Marcus, he was just getting started. In the quiet of his apartment, Marcus watched it all unfold on TV. He saw the anger on the streets, the protesters holding signs with his mother's face, chanting her name like a battle cry. The city was awake now, angry and demanding answers. But Marcus knew it wasn't enough. He had to keep moving, keep the pressure on, keep them on edge. His next move had to be perfect. The thing about vengeance, Marcus realized, was that it didn't matter how many times you struck it, wasn't going to bring your loved one back. But every death, every hit, made the world a little quieter, a little more still. He wasn't doing this just to hurt them. He was doing it to show them that they couldn't just kill his mother and get away with it, not without feeling it. Marcus had begun to learn the rules of the game. He knew how to stay invisible, how to blend in, how to erase any trace of his presence before he moved on. And that's exactly what he had been doing, waiting, watching, until the time was right. As Marcus prepared for his next move, the weight of what he was doing began to press down on him. Each hit had been carefully calculated. He had felt the cold satisfaction of taking down Officer Hawkins, but with each officer that fell, the emptiness inside him grew. Revenge wasn't making him feel whole. It wasn't making the pain go away. It was only feeding the darkness inside him, turning him into someone he barely recognized. The flashes of his mother's face, her final moments of life, haunted him. He could still see her gasping for air, still hear the desperation in her voice. He could still feel the way his heart had dropped when they told him she was gone. But as each officer fell, as each piece of the puzzle came together, he realized something. He would never stop. He would never get back the life he had lost, and no amount of bloodshed could ever undo the wrongs that had been done to him. But this was all he had left. His hand shook as he reached for the file in front of him, staring at the list of officers who were involved in his mother's death. Each name felt like a weight pressing down on him, a reminder of what he had to do, what he had promised himself. He was hunting them one by one, and no one was going to stop him. The department's sense of dread grew with every death. The fear that had been bubbling beneath the surface was now a full-blown panic. Marcus had become a ghost, an unseen force moving through their world, taking them down without leaving a trace. Every cop, every detective who had even a remote connection to his mother's death was now a target. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was a message. The department's own investigation was getting closer, but so was Marcus. The net was tightening and he could feel the pressure mounting, but he wasn't worried. He had learned how to move in silence, how to stay invisible. They would never catch him. The city was alive with fear. The police were on edge, desperate to find the killer, but their own mistakes and corruption kept getting in the way. They had underestimated him, underestimated how far he was willing to go, and now, they were going to pay the price. The more Marcus moved, the more he realized how much of himself he was losing in the process. The grief he had carried, the pain of losing his mother, was slowly being replaced by something colder, something more calculating. He wasn't just avenging his mother anymore. He was becoming a part of the system he had once fought against, a shadow moving through the streets, taking out anyone who had wronged him. Each death felt less like justice and more like a piece of his soul slipping away. He wasn't sure how much of himself was left, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stop now. He had promised his mother that he would make them pay, and he would. The world was quieter now. Marcus had already learned the rules of the game: how to move unseen, how to blend in with the shadows, how to erase every trace of his presence before disappearing. It had become second nature to him, like breathing. He was no longer the man who had watched in helpless rage as his mother died alone in a jail cell. That man was gone, replaced by something darker, something colder. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a predator, hunting down the ones responsible for his mother's death, one by one. The second officer was different. This one wasn't just a name on a list. Officer Jason Halt had been the one to drag his mother out of the car that night, to throw her on the hood of the vehicle, to ignore her desperate pleas for help. He had been the one who slammed the cuffs on her wrists and watched her body crumple in pain as she struggled to breathe. That memory burned in Marcus' mind. Halt had been an active participant in the brutality that had killed his mother. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about making them feel what they had made his mother feel: helpless, vulnerable, and alone. Halt needed to pay, and Marcus was going to make sure he did. The plan was simple, and Marcus had been working on it for days. Halt had a routine. He always went to the same bar on Fridays, drank with the same group of friends, and left at the same time every night. Marcus knew the exact location of the bar, the hours it would take for Halt to stagger out into the cold night, and the moment he would get into his car to drive home. Marcus had studied the officer, watching from a distance, learning his habits, his weaknesses. There was no room for error, no mistakes. Marcus had already made up his mind. Halt wasn't going to get the same treatment as the first officer. No clean hit this time. Halt was going to feel it. The night was colder than Marcus had expected, the wind biting at his skin as he stood hidden in the alley across from the bar. His fingers twitched with nervous energy as he checked the time on his phone. It was almost midnight. Halt would be walking out soon. Marcus could already feel the tension creeping up his spine, the anticipation building as the minutes dragged on. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he wondered if he was making a mistake. But then he thought of his mother, of her gasping for air, of the fear in her eyes as the officer's hands closed around her arms. That fear had never left him, and neither had the rage. Halt stepped out of the bar, laughing with a few of his friends as they made their way toward the parking lot. Marcus didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, silently, closing the distance between him and Halt in seconds. His gun was already in his hand, the cold steel a reminder of everything he had become. Halt was still laughing, too drunk to notice the shadow that was moving toward him. Marcus was behind him now, just a few feet away, and in that moment, everything felt frozen in time. But Marcus was quick, he was precise. He didn't give Halt a chance to react. With one smooth motion, he pressed the gun against the back of Halt's head, just under the hairline where the skull was softest. "Walk," Marcus growled. Halt froze, his laughter dying in his throat. He turned slightly, eyes wide with shock, but Marcus shoved him forward, guiding him toward an alley that was hidden in the shadows. The streets were empty at this time of night, and the world felt eerily still, as if it were holding its breath for what was about to happen. Marcus pushed Halt up against a brick wall, his hand tightening on the officer's shoulder, forcing him to face the cold concrete. Halt was still drunk, his eyes unfocused, but he could feel the fear starting to sink in. His hand shook as he reached for his gun, but Marcus had already anticipated it. In one swift motion, he knocked the weapon from Halt's hand and shoved him harder against the wall. "You don't get to run from this," Marcus whispered. The tension in the air was palpable now. Halt could barely process what was happening. His mind was still fogged with alcohol, but the fear was beginning to creep in. What do you want?" he stammered, his voice wavering. "I want you to know what it feels like," Marcus said, his voice colder than the night air, "to feel helpless, to feel like you're dying and no one cares. That's what my mother felt when you left her to rot in that cell. And now you're going to feel it too." Halt's breathing was quick, frantic, but it was too late. Marcus was no longer the grieving son. He was an avenger, and Halt was just another name on the list. With a swift motion, Marcus pressed the barrel of the gun against Halt's stomach, a calculated shot. clean and precise. The officer gasped as the life was sucked from him in an instant, his body going limp as he crumpled to the ground. A moment, the shot rang out. Marcus froze. The world around him seemed to stand still for a second. Halt's body hit the ground with a soft thud, but the silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stood there, watching the life drain from Halt's eyes, feeling the weight of what he had just done. The action was quick, cold, and efficient, but there was no relief. No satisfaction. He had thought that this would make him feel something, anything, but instead, he was left with the same empty feeling that had haunted him since his mother died. Nothing could fill that void. Nothing could undo what had been taken from him, and as he stood there, looking at the officer's lifeless body, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing himself in this quest for vengeance. As Marcus wiped the gun clean and disappeared into the shadows, the weight of his actions settled heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't the first kill, and it wouldn't be the last, but each one felt more hollow than the last. He wasn't the man who had walked into this fight with a sense of justice. No, that man had been consumed by the very thing he was fighting against. He had killed a man who had participated in the death of his mother, but as he walked away, he didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a man who had avenged his family. He felt like a shadow, a ghost moving through the streets, taking lives, but losing his own in the process. The fire of vengeance was still burning, but it was starting to consume him, bit by bit. As the night went on, Marcus couldn't escape the image of Halt's face. The fear in his eyes as he realized what was about to happen. It wasn't the same. As watching his mother die, he wasn't an innocent victim, and Halt was no longer a symbol of the system, but the emptiness lingered, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that every life he took was one more step away from the man he used to be. The investigation would grow more desperate now. The department would start to understand that they weren't dealing with a random vigilante. They were dealing with someone with a specific target in mind. They would know they were being hunted, and Marcus knew that they wouldn't stop looking. For him, they would be watching every corner, every street, every alley, trying to figure out who was behind the deaths. But Marcus had already planned his next move. The cat-and-mouse game had begun, and he wasn't about to let them catch him. The sound of the city had changed. What had started as whispers, rumors about the vigilante picking off cops, was now a roar. The protests were louder, the chants angrier, and the media coverage more intense. What Marcus had done, what he had started, had become a movement, a call for justice, that resonated with the people who felt like the system had abandoned them. The first few nights, it had been quiet. His actions, his targets, were still unknown to the public. But as the bodies piled up, as the police department scrambled to cover their tracks, the public had begun to notice. They saw the pattern, they saw the connection between his mother's death and the officers who had been involved. They saw that the system, the same system that had failed Marcus, had also failed them. Now, his name Marcus was whispered in the streets, though no one knew who he was. The city felt like it was on the edge of something big, something explosive. The social media posts were everywhere, the hashtags trending, and every news outlet had started covering the growing unrest. The pressure was mounting, but Marcus wasn't just a name, now he was a symbol. A symbol for the people who had lost everything to a broken system. As the days passed, the protests grew. More people joined in, marching with signs that read "Justice for Kira" or "No justice, no peace." The murals of Kira's face painted on walls across the city became shrines, places for people to gather, to mourn, and to fight. The city had become a battlefield, but it wasn't just for Kira anymore. It was for everyone who had ever felt silenced, forgotten, or trampled on by those meant to serve and protect. Marcus watched from the shadows, from a distance, his heart heavy. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the city to rise up in his name, to rally behind his actions. He had only wanted to avenge his mother's death, to make those responsible feel the same helplessness she had. But now, as the city burned with outrage, Marcus realized that his actions were part of something bigger, something that had already gone beyond his control. He stood on a rooftop one night, overlooking the crowd below as they marched through the streets. The glow of the streetlights flickered over their faces, their signs waving in the air. There were people of all races, all backgrounds, standing together, unified in their demand for justice. For a moment, Marcus didn't know if he felt proud or terrified. The people were fighting for him, for his cause. But he knew it wouldn't be long before the cops caught on to the fact that this wasn't just some random act of violence. They would start looking for the man behind the murders, and Marcus knew that when they did, they would find him. But that wasn't his concern right now. He didn't care about being caught. What haunted him was the realization that his quest for vengeance had set the city on a path that could lead to something worse than what they had already been through. He hadn't thought about the bigger picture when he had pulled the trigger, but now the city was teetering on the brink of chaos. People were rallying behind him, but they didn't know him. They didn't know the cost of what he had done. They didn't know how much it had changed him, twisted him into something darker. The police were closing in. The investigation had reached a fever pitch, and every department was now involved. The pressure on the cops was suffocating. They had tried to bury the truth, to hide behind their uniforms, but now it was too late. The people had seen too much. They had connected the dots between the officer deaths, the protests, and Marcus's mother's case. Detective Carter had been working around the clock, following the trail of destruction left by the mysterious killer. He had started to piece things together, seeing a pattern in the attacks. Each officer who had been involved in Kira's death was being targeted one by one. The city was on high alert, and they were beginning to suspect that whoever was behind these killings wasn't just doing it out of some personal vendetta. They were sending a message. Every death follows the same pattern, Carter muttered, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. He stared at the board covered in photos and red markers, each line connecting officers, dates, and locations. A map of grief and retribution that was impossible to ignore. But even with all their evidence, the department couldn't crack the case. They couldn't figure out who the killer was, how he was getting so close to the officers, or why he was doing it. The more they dug, the more questions arose, and the more desperate they became to stop the killings before the city tore itself apart. As Marcus watched the chaos unfold, a deep sense of emptiness lingered in him. The guilt he had been running from for days, maybe weeks, now settled in his chest, heavy and suffocating. His mother's death had been a starting point, a catalyst for the storm that had engulfed everything around him. But the storm was far bigger than he had ever anticipated. He had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. And the more he looked at the faces in the crowd below, the more he felt the weight of what he had become. Marcus had never intended for the people to rally behind him. He had never thought that his actions, his quest for justice, would turn him into a symbol of something bigger than himself. But now, as the protests continued, as the police scrambled to find him, he realized that his revenge had given the city something it had lost: hope. Hope that someone was fighting for them. Someone was fighting for justice when the system refused to. But that hope was also built on a foundation of blood. The weight of that truth crushed him. The news coverage was relentless. The headlines screamed about the mysterious killer, the one who had targeted the officers involved in Kira's death. The media was beginning to get closer to the truth. The police had their theories. They thought they were closing in on the killer's identity. They knew he was targeting those involved with Kira's arrest, and they knew the city was watching. They began to put more resources into the investigation, tightening their grip on the streets. They were coming for him, and Marcus could feel it. But there was no turning back now. He could still hear the chants in the streets, the voices of the people rising up, calling for justice. For a fleeting moment, Marcus felt like he had accomplished something. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just another victim, another forgotten face in a system built to crush him. But as he listened to the chants, the anger, the calls for justice, he also felt the emptiness. Marcus's actions had made him something he couldn't recognize anymore. The man who had walked into this with a sense of justice, who had wanted to make things right, was gone. He was no longer just a son mourning his mother. He was an avenger, a killer, a man who had set a fire that could never be put out. The weight of it was crushing. Every life he took felt like it stripped another piece of himself away. Revenge was never the answer. It had never been about making things right. It had been about making the system feel the pain he felt. But with every death, Marcus realized that no amount of blood would bring his mother back. No amount of violence would make him whole again. The fire inside him burned bright, but it was starting to consume him, little by little. And in the quiet moments, when he allowed himself to feel, the guilt crept in. Was this really justice? Or had he become the monster he had once despised? The city was watching, but Marcus didn't know if he could keep running, if he could keep playing the game. The fear, the anger, the pain, it was all starting to catch up to him. The system had broken him, and now he was breaking the world around him. And for the first time, Marcus wasn't sure who he was anymore. The city had been holding its breath for days, for weeks. The chaos, the protests, the fear, it had all been building to this moment. Marcus had spent every day since the first officer fell planning, calculating, and waiting. The first 2 deaths had been necessary actions taken to send a message. to show the system what happened when they ignored the lives of black people. But this final kill, this one was personal. The last officer in the chain was Officer Thomas Walker, the man who had been the first to arrest Marcus' mother, who had been the one to grab her from the car and slam her onto the hood. It was Walker who had witnessed her pleading for help, her face turning pale as the air left her lungs. And yet, Walker had turned a blind eye. He had done nothing, just like the others, just like the system that had allowed it to happen. Marcus had followed him for days, watched his routines, studied his life. He knew where Walker lived, what bars he went to, and what time he took his lunch breaks. He knew Walker's weaknesses, his drunken nights, his tired shifts, the way he let his guard down when he thought no one was watching. But Marcus wasn't here for a clean kill. No, tonight was different. He had already taken so much from the system. His revenge had been swift, calculated, but hollow. Walker's death would be different. It had to be. This was the last piece of justice for his mother, and it would be as painful for Walker as it had been for her. The night was cold, and the air felt heavier than usual. Marcus stood in the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest, his fingers clenching around the familiar grip of the gun. This moment had been building ever since he had first watched his mother die in that cell. His anger, his grief, it had all led him to this. But now, standing there in the cold, a deep sense of exhaustion crept over him. The fire that had driven him for so long was starting to feel like a weight, a burden he wasn't sure he could carry anymore. Walker's car was parked outside a rundown diner in an alleyway, its headlights cutting through the dark. He had parked there, often Marcus had been watching for days. Walker was tired tonight. His movements were sluggish, his face paled from the weight of too many late shifts and too much alcohol. It was the perfect time. Marcus didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly, silently, his steps blending with the darkness around him. Marcus approached Walker's car, his breath steady as he calculated every step. The officer was sitting inside, staring blankly out the window, probably lost in thought or trying to shake off the last remnants of a hard night. Marcus could feel the weight of everything bearing down on him. This was it, the final confrontation. This was the moment when everything would come to an end. He slid into the back seat of Walker's car, moving with the precision he had learned over the past weeks. He didn't speak. There was no need for words. Walker didn't even notice the door opening, his tired mind far too distracted to sense the danger closing in on him. Marcus pressed the gun against the back of Walker's head, the cold steel against his skin, and for the first time in months, Marcus felt a calmness that surprised him. "I've been waiting for this," Marcus said quietly, his voice low but steady. Walker's body stiffened, his eyes wide with panic as he realized what was happening. "What the hell do you want?" he croaked, his voice shaking. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, his face inches from Walker's. He wanted him to see the anger in his eyes, to understand the depth of the pain and rage that had driven him to this moment. He wanted Walker to feel the weight of what he had done. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about making him understand that Marcus' mother had mattered, that her life had meant something, and Walker had taken that from him. "You left her to die," Marcus whispered. "You watched her suffocate, and didn't do a damn thing." Walker's eyes darted around, his panic escalating as the realization of what was coming hit him. "I didn't mean please, man. I didn't." The words cut off as Marcus pulled the trigger. The shot was precise, quick, clean right between Walker's eyes. The officer slumped against the steering wheel, lifeless before he even had a chance to comprehend the weight of what had happened. Marcus didn't move immediately. The car was silent, save for the faint hum of the engine. Walker's body was still, his face frozen in shock and fear. For a moment, Marcus didn't feel anything. The rush of adrenaline, the anger that had driven him so far, seemed to fade away. He was left with a quiet emptiness, a hollow ache that had been growing inside him since his mother had died. As he sat there in the stillness of the car, the weight of the moment sank in. He had done what he set out to do. He had killed the man who had been responsible for his mother's suffering. But in the back of his mind, something gnawed at him. The city was still in chaos, the protests still raged, and the police were now closing in on him. And none of it had brought his mother back. None of it had healed the wound in his chest that had only grown deeper with each life he took. Marcus looked at Walker's body one last time, the officer's empty gaze staring at nothing, and realized the truth he had been running from. Vengeance was never going to bring him peace. The fire of revenge had burned so hot for so long, but it had consumed him completely. It had taken away the man he used to be, the man who had been driven by love and a desire for justice. Now all that was left was a hollow shell of someone who didn't know how to stop. He had taken the final step. The last officer who had been involved in his mother's death was gone, and with him, so was the last piece of Marcus' soul. The police would be on him now. They had to know that they were dealing with a man who wasn't just angry, he was relentless. Marcus had taken down the last officer on his list, but he could already feel the tightening grip of the investigation. They would find him. They would close in, and they would stop him if they could. But Marcus wasn't afraid. The fear that had once gripped him, that had kept him paralyzed in his grief, was gone. It had been replaced by something else, something cold, something darker. He had already made his peace with the fact that he wouldn't survive this. But as long as the truth of his mother's death was known, as long as the world knew what had happened, he would keep going. He would die with the satisfaction of knowing that he had given them the justice they refused to give him. As Marcus stepped away from the car, he felt the weight of everything he had done. The emptiness inside him had only grown. He had taken revenge, but in the process, he had lost himself. His mother's death had shattered him, and now, in the wake of everything he had done, he realized that the pieces would never fit back together. He wasn't the same person who had once been hopeful, who had once believed that justice could be found through the system. That man was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that vengeance, though powerful, was a hollow pursuit. He had started this journey to make the world pay for what they had done to his mother. But in the end, Marcus realized that no amount of bloodshed would ever fill the void that had been left in his heart, and as he walked away from the scene, the city still echoing with the sounds of unrest and anger, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the storm he had started would never end, and neither would the emptiness inside him. The city had erupted. It was the chaos Marcus had known was coming. The protests had reached a fever pitch, the streets filled with angry voices chanting for justice, for answers. The murals of face that had once been symbols of grief now stood as emblems of defiance, painted on the walls and buildings where the cries for change echoed loud enough to be heard from every corner of the city. Marcus had given them a cause, and they had run with it, fueled by the anger of a system that had broken them all. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence that followed the final killing. The killing of Officer Thomas Walker, the last man who had touched his mother, the one who had done nothing when she begged for help. With his death, Marcus had completed his mission, the last piece of justice for his mother. But as the sirens wailed in the distance and the media frenzy reached its peak, Marcus was already gone. He wasn't watching the world change. He wasn't there to see the rallies or hear the calls for reform. He was slipping away into the shadows. As invisible as the ghost he had become, the department was scrambling, trying to cover its tracks. The police had no answers, only speculation. The officers who had survived the strikes weren't speaking, their lips sealed tight as they stood behind their badges and their thinly veiled corruption. The department issued statements, tried to reassure the public that they were doing everything they could to find the killer, but deep down they all knew the truth: no one would ever find Marcus. Not now. He had disappeared, his name swallowed by the very city he had fought for. The city that would forget him as easily as it had forgotten his mother. Marcus' journey had come to an end. He had started out as a man full of grief and rage, a man determined to make the system pay for the death of his mother. But now, standing on the edge of the world he had known, he was nothing more than a shadow, his revenge complete, but the price too high to be measured. His steps were quiet as he made his way through the alleyways, his face hidden beneath the hood of his jacket. The streets he had walked through so many times before were now unfamiliar, like a city he had never seen. There was no satisfaction in his heart as he thought about what he had done, no relief, only a hollow emptiness, a gnawing ache that had settled deep in his chest and refused to let go. He had avenged his mother, but at what cost? The world was already moving on. The name of Marcus Harris, the man who had been both hero and villain, would soon fade from the headlines, buried beneath the flood of new stories and new faces. People would forget about him, just as they had forgotten about his mother. The media would move on to the next big tragedy, the next scandal to distract them from the truth. They would forget about the murders, about the city that had stood at the edge of chaos and watched as its people cried out for justice. And just like that, Marcus would be a memory, a whisper in the wind, a name no one cared to remember. His legacy that would remain. That wasn't about the killings anymore. It wasn't about the blood that had been spilled. It was about the message he had sent, the truth that had come to light through the shadows of his revenge. People would talk about the vigilante who had brought justice to those who had been untouchable. They would rally behind the cause, just as they had rallied for his mother, and they would push for change in ways the system had never imagined. The death of the officers was just the beginning. The city had woken up, and now, the truth couldn't be buried again. The world couldn't unsee what had happened. Marcus had made sure of that, but he wouldn't be around to see it. The city would change, but not for him, not for the man who had become a symbol, a ghost, haunting the streets he had once called home. As Marcus slipped through the back door of a forgotten building, he felt the weight of everything he had done. His body ached from the long nights, the adrenaline, the constant pressure of living in the shadows. He had been so sure that revenge would heal him, so sure that once he had done what needed to be done, the pain would subside. But as he sat alone in the dark, staring at the blank walls around him, he realized the truth. There was no victory in this. His mother would never walk through that door, no matter how many officers he had taken down, no matter how much blood had been spilled. She would never come back. The pain was still there, just as raw, just as unbearable as it had been the night he lost her. But now, there was no one left to blame, no system to fight against. He had become the very thing he had once hated, someone willing to destroy to make a point, someone who had lost himself in the pursuit of vengeance. That as the darkness closed in around him, Marcus felt a tear slip down his cheek, the weight of it more crushing than any bullet could ever be. His quest for justice had turned into something else, something darker. The man he had once been was gone, replaced by a ghost, a shadow of his former self. He had completed his mission. He had made the system pay, but at the cost of his soul. The hollow victory that had once felt so sweet now tasted like ash in his mouth. In the final moments, as Marcus stood in the shadows, his body trembling with exhaustion, he realized that he had lost everything. His mother, his peace, his sense of self, all of it had been torn apart in the wake of his need for revenge. He had traded it all for a mission he thought would bring him closure. But now all he had was emptiness. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Another message, another call from someone who still thought he was out there, someone who still believed in the cause. But Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. There was no one left for him to save. The man who had once fought for justice, who had once dreamed of a better world, was gone. All that remained was the pain. The city had changed, yes, but Marcus hadn't. He was still the same man who had watched his mother die and had sworn revenge. And now, as the world moved on without him, Marcus knew the truth. Vengeance had never been the answer. It hadn't healed his heart. It hadn't fixed the broken pieces of his life. It had only left him more lost, more empty than before. As Marcus disappeared into the night, the city carrying on without him, he realized there was no victory here, no satisfaction, no peace, only the echo of his mother's final words, lost in the void. And with that realization, Marcus finally understood the cost of revenge. It had taken everything from him, his humanity, his soul, and the hope he once held. The price of justice was higher than he had ever imagined. And now, there was nothing left.